Hello, everybody. I have been reading to you a chapter book, and we already talked about some of the areas of a story. One that we talked about was the setting, and you know the story that we're reading or have been reading is Goonie Bird Greene. And the setting for this story, if you remember, is a second grade classroom. And we also talked about a main character. And of course, the main character in this story is Goonie Bird Greene. And we have found that she came into the classroom in October. She walked in, she was dressed with pajamas and cowboy boots. She looked very different. And everybody in the class was really interested. Who is this person? So we learned last time in chapter 2 how she got this strange name of Goonie Bird. Her parents actually named her that. And now we are on chapter 3. Her teacher, Mrs. Pigeon, kind of relented to let her tell the story that she had about how she got her name. So today, I think she's going to tell another story. On Friday, Goonie Bird was wearing capri pants, a satin tank top, and a long string of pearls. Her hair was twisted into one long braid, which was decorated with plastic flowers. There were flip-flops on her feet. "You look beautiful," Keiko said to Goonie Bird in an admiring whisper. "Yes, I know," said Goonie Bird. "Thank you, Keiko." She walked in front of the classroom when Mrs. Pigeon told her it was her time. Malcolm was in the back of the classroom. He was at his desk writing, "I will never put anything in my nose again," 100 times on a piece of lined paper. The nurse had told him to do that. She said it would keep his hands busy. "How come Goonie Bird gets to go stand in front of the class?" Malcolm asked. "Shh, everybody except Felicity Ann," said to Malcolm. "Listen." "Today," Goonie Bird said, "I have a very exciting story to tell you. In my story, there is a long journey, a mystery, and a rescue." Mrs. Pigeon, seated at her desk, had begun to correct spelling papers. She looked up. "Listen, second graders," she said. "Hear the different things Goonie Bird is putting into her story? That is what a good storyteller does." Goonie Bird listened patiently to the teacher. Then she stood up straight, did some breathing exercises. Finally, she took a deep breath and looked at the class. "I am ready to begin," she said at last. "The title of the story for today is How Will Goonie Bird Come from China on a Flying Carpet?" "Just like Aladdin," Barry Tuckerman said in a loud whisper. "Barry, pay attention, please," Goonie Bird said. "I like to have absolutely all eyes on me." Then, when the class became silent, all except Felicity Ann, of course she was under her desk, who had been silent all along, and almost all eyes, even Mrs. Pigeon's, went on her, she began. And here's her title, How Goonie Bird Came from China on a Flying Carpet. Sounds very strange. "Once upon a time, just last month," Mr. and Mrs. Greene decided to take their little girl, Goonie Bird, and move away from the place where they had always lived. They had always lived in China, but now Mr. Greene had a new job, and his new job was in Water Tower. "That's here," Chelsea said aloud. "I live in Water Tower." Goonie Bird stopped talking. She arranged her pearl necklace so that it was draped over one shoulder. "Me too," Tricia said. "We all live in Water Tower," Ben pointed out. "That's why we go to Watertown Elementary School." "Class," Mrs. Pigeon warned. "Mrs. Pigeon," Goonie Bird said politely, "let me take care of this." "Children," she said in a firm voice, "I cannot tell a story if I am constantly interrupted. There will be time for questions and comments. Please raise your hands if you want to say something. It's very distracting for me if you call out." "Sorry," Tricia said. "Sorry," Chelsea said. "Sorry," Ben added. The class waited. Goonie Bird looked at them all sternly. Then she did some breathing exercises and began again. They had always lived in China, but now Mr. Greene had a new job, and his new job was in Water Tower. So they packed carefully. Took many days. First, Mr. Greene had to pack 43 sets of false teeth. Then Mrs. Greene had to pack her dancing shoes and her bathing suits. And Goonie Bird had to pack all her belongings, which included a money collection. Finally, their furniture was loaded onto a moving van, and the Greene family waved goodbye as the moving van drove away from China and started its journey to Water Tower. Goonie Bird stopped. Every child in the classroom had raised their hand. Even Mrs. Pigeon was waving her hand. "I'll have an intermission for questions," Goonie Bird said. "Chelsea, yours first. Why did Mr. Greene have 43 pairs of false teeth?" Chelsea asked. "The false teeth are not a part of this story," Goonie Bird said. "Malcolm?" Malcolm had looked up from his "I will not put anything in my nose" paper. His eyes were very wide. "Tell about the money collection," he said. "That's another story," Goonie Bird said. "Beanie?" "When are you going to tell about the prince and the diamonds?" Beanie said. Goonie Bird thought it over. "On Monday I'll tell it," she said. "Now there's time for one more question before I continue. Mrs. Pigeon, did you have your hand raised?" Mrs. Pigeon nodded. "Goonie Bird," she said in a nice voice, "you have an amazing imagination, and we think you are wonderful at telling stories. Don't we, class?" She looked around and almost all the children nodded. "But I want to be certain that the children understand that these are made-up stories. So I want to point out, my stories are absolutely true," Goonie Bird said. "I want to point out," Mrs. Pigeon went on, "that of course we all know that China is a foreign country across the ocean, and that a moving van could never drive from China to Water Tower." Goonie Bird rearranged her pearls and sighed. "Mrs. Pigeon," she said, "why don't we take a few minutes for research? Is there an atlas in the bookcase?" Mrs. Pigeon laughed and said, "Of course." So we went to the bookcase and took out a book of maps called an atlas. "Now," said Goonie Bird, "would you find out if there are other Chinas?" "Other Chinas? I don't think." Mrs. Pigeon began turning the pages of the atlas. She found the index at the back. "My goodness," Mrs. Pigeon said after a minute, "there's a China in Texas." "Correct," said Goonie Bird. "And what else?" There's a China in Maine. Correct, said Goonie Bird. And California. There's a China Lake. Oh, and my goodness, look, in North Carolina. And now it's time to continue my story, Goonie Bird announced. Where were we? Oh, yes, I remember. The moving van had just left China. She took up her story again. After the moving van left China, the Greene family loaded up their station wagon with 5 big suitcases. Then they added a lawnmower that they had forgotten to put in the moving van, a cooler full of ham sandwiches and iced tea, a bundled up sack of National Geographics, and an orange and white cat named Catman, who had no tail because he had flicked his former tail once under the lawnmower. The last thing they put into the station wagon was a rolled up rug from the front porch of their house. It was too long to fit. They tried it sideways and folded and upside down, but it still wouldn't fit. Oh, let's leave it behind, Mr. Greene suggested. But Mrs. Greene began to cry. It's my mother's, she said. There's a stain on it where my mother spilled some black bean soup 40 years ago. I feel sentimental about that rug. So Mr. Greene agreed to take the rug because it made him cry too if his wife cried. He decided to put the back window of the station wagon down so that the end of the rolled up rug could stick out. He made certain that everything was nicely arranged and that Catman had a comfortable place to sleep on the back seat, just beneath the end of the rug and next to the place where Goonie Bird would sit. Mr. and Mrs. Greene and Goonie Bird all got into the car and drove away from the Chinatown, starting their long journey to Watertower. They drove for many, many hours. They ate all the ham sandwiches and drank all the iced tea. They stopped to get gas. They went to the bathroom. They played the car radio and listened to news and operas and football games and talk shows about love relationships. Suddenly, Goonie Bird glanced down and noticed with dismay that her beloved Catman had disappeared. She looked around the floor of the back seat, but Catman was not there. She heard a small sound like a purr coming from inside the rolled up rug. She knew that Catman had entered the rug. He probably found it warm and dark and a cozy place. But Goonie Bird was worried about Catman. She decided to try to get him out. She reached into the rolled up center of the rug, but he slithered away beyond her hands. She looked at the backs of her parents' heads, wondering if she could tell them about the problem with Catman. But her mother was dozing and her father was driving, watching the road carefully and listening to a radio program about whales. So Goonie Bird decided to wiggle into the rug herself to rescue Catman. Oh no, Kelko cried. I'm going to faint. Shh, the other children said. It was dark and dusty and very tight squeezed inside the rolled up rug, but Goonie Bird wiggled inch by inch toward Catman. Catman slithered away inch by inch. She could see his glittering eyes as he backed away from her hands. Goonie Bird was determined to rescue him. She continued forward. Suddenly, an amazing thing happened. Even though Goonie Bird was not very large and did not weigh very much and was not wearing her heavy diamond earrings from the palace that day, her weight inside the rolled up rug caused it to tilt. At that moment, Mr. Greene leaned forward to change the radio station, and the car went over a pothole in the road. The rolled up rug containing both Catman and Goonie Bird slid out of the back of the station wagon and flew through the air before it landed at the side of the road in some thick grass beside a fence post. A cow chewing a purple flower looked curiously at it and then wandered away. The station wagon drove on around a curve in the road. Slowly, the rug unrolled. Catman's fur was standing on end, and if he had had a tail, his tail would have been sticking straight up in the air. For a moment, Catman stood still looking at Goonie Bird, and then he ran away very fast. Goonie Bird sat up. She was not entirely sure what had happened, but she was not hurt. She simply wondered where her family was, and her cat, and the car. Other cars stopped and people got out. Many people offered her a drink of water from their bottles. But Goonie Bird wasn't thirsty after all. After a while, a police car with a flashing light came. A TV reporter came, and a cameraman. While the policeman talked on his radio, the TV reporter, a woman with very large hair, interviewed Goonie Bird and called her the little girl who had a flying carpet ride. In the interview, Goonie Bird described Catman and asked people to call the station if they found him, but she didn't get Catman back. Eventually, the police car took her to her parents, who were both crying at the gas station from 4 miles down the road. When Goonie Bird and her parents were finally reunited, everyone, including 2 policemen, a TV reporter, and the gas station owner, hugged and kissed and did the tango. The end. What a lovely story, Mrs. Pigeon said, and an exciting one too, but a little sad to lose your kitty that way. Catman is not a kitty, Goonie Bird said. He's a cat. And I didn't say that I lost him. I just said that I never got him back. So no one found him and called the TV station? Actually, they did, Goonie Bird said. But where is Catman now? Asked Mrs. Pigeon. He was consumed by a cow, Goonie Bird said. But that's a different story. By a cow? You're joking, Mrs. Pigeon said. No, said Goonie Bird, I'm not joking. I tell only absolutely true stories. Tell it, the children called. I will, Goonie Bird said, another day. And that's another chapter in the story of Goonie Bird Greene. Thanks for listening.